Good morning, everybody. My name is Bruce McDonald, and we're here with this episode of Academics of PA. And I'm joined by my absolutely awesome and amazing co-host, Josie Schafer.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, Josie, how's it going?
I'm good. Thank you. How are you?
Not too shabby.
Great. Well, we have a wonderful guest with us, Dr. Camilla Stivers. Thank you so much for being with us. We are so excited to have you. I am so excited to have you, that's for sure.
Good. I'm excited too. So that makes three of us.
Thank you. So, Bruce, I don't know if you heard the conversation, but Dr. Stivers just asked me, how do people know about this podcast if they're not on Twitter? That's actually a really good question that I think we need to grapple with here pretty soon.
Yeah, I don't actually know the good answer to that.
Right. Wow, that critical mind of hers. Thank you.
No, it's a function of age. Because I'm not on Twitter, but I'm probably one of the five elders in PA who's not. So I don't think it really matters.
Who are the five elders of PA now? I'm interested.
No, that was the guess, that there might be five people in PA who are not on Twitter, and mostly that would be because they're of an age. So,
okay, I get it. Okay, so Dr. Stivers, can you tell us, how did you come to the field of public administration?
Well, I came because it was kind of the next thing in front of me. I started working in 1968, and that was a time when the so-called urban crisis had hit cities, and there was a lot of money around from the federal government, all kinds of stuff that was being ginned up in cities. I was living in Baltimore at the time. And so my first job was working for something called the Higher Education Council on Urban Affairs, which was pretty much all the higher ed institutions in the Baltimore area. And they had been formed, as they said, to, try to do something to help solve or ameliorate the urban crisis. And they hired me as their sole staff member, which in retrospect, I think was a pretty good sign of how unserious they really were, because I was totally green. I had nothing but, commitment and ambition. And I learned an awful lot. Okay, so that was the start of a 20-year period in my life when I was what we call today a practitioner. I was almost always, with just a couple of relatively brief exceptions, working for nonprofit organizations. But after most of the first decade, I ended up in Washington, D.C., working for a consortium of community-based organizations in what was called in D.C. then, and probably still is, east of the river. So in other words, the neighborhoods that are east of the Anacostia River, which most people on the west side, or elsewhere, don't even know is part of D.C., out past RFK Stadium. And that's about a 99% Black neighborhood or area. It's 250,000 people, so that's kind of bigger than a neighborhood. And they hired me because I had experience in trying to link higher ed institutions with grassroots communities. And so I went from working for the universities to working for the community. And I was much more at home there, because when I'd worked at the higher ed institutions, I thought they were serious. And I found out that what they thought was serious was pretty much not what I thought was. And so I worked for that group for a few years, and then one of the guys on my board was a spearhead in starting a federally supported community health center in the East of the River area, which came to be called East of the River Health Center. And he asked me to come over and work for him. And so I did spend several years working at East of the River as a kind of Jill of all trades, because community health centers operate, of course, they receive federal funding, but they also have to collect reimbursement from the people who have a way of paying, including Medicaid, of course. And so they operate lean and mean. The feds really held our feet to the fire. We're not allowed to hire a whole lot of administrative staff. So I did everything from grant writing to publicity to staff training to I don't know what all. I mean, that whole 20 years of experience shaped the entire rest of my career for sure. It's absolutely central to my perspective on public administration, to my the topics that were of interest to me that I ended up writing about, and so on. So it was during the time I was at east of the river that I had gotten an MPA along the way. Let's inject that. But my boss said when we started, he said, neither of us really knows beans about health policy or health administration. So the University of Southern California has a center down right off of DuPont Circle where they give courses, and they have courses in health stuff. So why don't we go down and take those courses? So we did. And it was a 3-course package, and I took that. And well, that was how I got into taking my MPA, actually. I put the cart before the horse because I realized then, this was in the late 70s, that I was a third of the way towards an MPA. And I never thought about getting an MPA, but I was a perpetual student. So I said, oh, well, why stop now? So I took the 9 courses. They didn't require you could write a thesis, but they didn't require you to. And I actually wanted to, and they discouraged me from doing it. So anyway, I got the MPA, and then a few years later, I got a flyer in the mail from Virginia Tech, which was starting a center in the Washington area. Everybody wanted to have a center in the Washington area because that's where all the public administrators were, you know. And that's the bank they were trying to rob, because that's where the money was. And so I looked at the flyer and I saw Jim Wolf's name on it. And I had taken a couple of classes with Jim at USC when he was there. And I thought, oh, I know him. I'll go talk to him. So I did. And I enrolled in the program, the doctoral program at Virginia Tech. And it was not until I was about halfway through it that I thought, maybe I could actually teach. I mean, it was that long. I'd been active for 20 years. And I thought, I bet my interest, that was how I found out I was a theorist. Okay. It was Orion White who looked at me and said, "You're a theorist." I said, "Oh, really?" And I never thought of myself as a theorist because I'd worked at the grassroots all these years,
Well, so what was that conversation where he recognized that in you?
We were actually going over something that I had written. He had asked the class, he gave us a list of topics, and we had been reading Burrell and Morgan's Sociological Paradigms and Organizational Analysis. Okay, to me, this was like, striking it rich. I wanted to read everything that these guys mentioned, and who knew there was such a thing as paradigms? And actually, half the class took it very personally that they were being forced into a paradigm as if they could operate without one. And to me, it was just fantastic. So I decided that he said, then I want you to take one of these topics and write about it consciously from one of the paradigms that Burrell and Morgan laid out. So one of the paradigms was radical structuralism, in other words, Marxism. And I thought, oh, maybe I'm a maybe I'm a Marxist. And so I wrote about professionalism from a Marxist point of view. I mean, just not a big long thing, but just a few pages. And so then he sat down with each of us and went over what we had written. And it was kind of a coaching sort of session. And it was there that he said, when I look at what you wrote, I see, that you're very comfortable with theory, and you have a certain facility for it. And I thought, well, what do you know? And so then as I proceeded on through the PhD program, I thought, maybe I should switch careers. Maybe I should become a teacher. And I thought, with the practical experience that I have and the theoretical chops that I seem to be developing, maybe I'd really have something to offer. And so
I think so. It worked out.
well, yeah, it did. And I mean, in the sense that I've had a fantastically good time over the last 25 years or so. Okay, so
Question
yeah.
that I don't know that anyone has a good answer. So lots of, and maybe I think everyone who's taught in an MPA program might have struggled with this. Not all practitioners seem to embrace theory and how it can help them on the job. Did you recognize the ability of theory to inform you as a practitioner, or you just really, it was sort of something else you were good at?
Oh, no, I absolutely, see, I came into it without any prejudice, against it. And I was very lucky in my choice of my, not choice, I was assigned this wonderful guy, Orion White, who was just such an incredible teacher. And he encouraged us to think, I remember he said, what is a theory? We spent a long time talking about what a theory was. And I said, well, theory's kind of like a frame, it's like you holding a camera up to the world, and the way you frame the picture that you want to take is up to you. And it's not like you can choose what's out there, but you can choose the angle from which you look at it. And so that was the way I always approached theory. And as a matter of fact, I always thought I couldn't understand why these people were so hostile to the idea of theory, because to me, it was okay. So some of this stuff doesn't match my experience, but even that is useful because it tells me, okay, well, whatever it is, it's not that. Okay. That way of understanding it doesn't make sense to me, but there is a way. So, so it's like I just have to find the angle from which to point the camera so that I can understand what's going on. So I always thought of theory as a way of understanding what's happening. And I've always taught from the position that the one thing that practitioners really can't give themselves is an opportunity to step back and reflect on what they're doing and trying to see it from an angle that is somewhat raised above putting out fires and dealing with the next little crisis inside the bureaucracy and so forth, and enabling them to say, what is it that we're doing here? And is it working? Is it helping us to move forward, to move our project forward of trying to help people, for example?
During your career as a practitioner, too, you sort of suggested it was very hectic, right? You were a Jill of all trades. There wasn't a lot of administration. And
Right.
so that time, that space to now say, oh, wow, this is what I was doing, or this is what I meant, or this is how I could have changed things, was a really exciting turning point for you, right?
It
If you had
was.
very busy for 20 years and now you could say, how did it all come together?
Well, it's not like you don't do it while it's happening, but because my boss was his name was Jim Spate, and he was quite a force in the east of the river neighborhood. Absolutely fantastic guy. And he was very reflective himself. And we used to sit around and talk about, well, what's going on here? And how can we handle it? And what's the best way to approach it and all of that? Well, to me, that's theorizing. It's stepping a little back from putting out the fire to, trying to ask yourself, well, how did this fire get started in the first place?
It's amazing you had a boss like that. That is
Oh, yeah. He was just an amazing person. And I just learned a ton from him, just a ton.
Okay, so you're in the PhD program, you're building your theoretical chops, you are pulling from experiences as a practitioner. And what's now getting you excited? How are you imagining your future career?
Well, so I had this kind of epiphany that I thought, you know what, maybe I really could teach. And what appealed to me about teaching was maybe I could, foster opportunities for practitioners, particularly, to understand better what they're up to and therefore be able to be more effective. And so, well, I guess the next big step was doing my dissertation, and I did my dissertation on the notion of active citizenship in public
Oh, wow.
administration and what that meant. And I used the federal community health center program as a kind of case example of active citizenship because became very clear to me sitting in the board meetings. The boards of community health centers have to be, by law, a majority has to be made up of people who use the services. And so I had many opportunities to sit in on board meetings and listen to the board members trying to figure out what to do next, and it became very clear to me that because their overriding concern was the health and welfare of the community that they lived in. I said to myself, if that ain't active citizenship, I don't know what would be. That was what inspired me. It was they who inspired me to write about active citizenship. And so in the process of doing that, I said to myself, well, I can't stop now. I've got to pursue this because I want to write stuff that, drop little pebbles of thought into this big ocean and maybe have an impact at some point. So that was why I decided to get an academic job. And so I ended up at the Evergreen State College in Washington State, which was about the best place I could possibly have ended up because Evergreen is a very sort of alternative college. And it's teaching, teaching, teaching. It's not research, teaching, and service there. It's teaching. They're fine if you want to write, but it doesn't it doesn't get you anywhere. It's a very alternative place. There's no faculty rank. There's no departments as as you usually think of them. And so it was a wonderful place for me because I could sort of do things that were meaningful to me. And I spent 10 years there before I switched and went to Cleveland State, where I spent the rest of my academic career. But see, I mean, my whole life has unfolded in a very weird way. I defended my dissertation a month before I turned 50. Okay. So, by that time, I was. I was ready to roll academically, So,
Well, so you're very prolific. You write a great deal, or, it appears that way from someone who reads your work. But you mentioned that you were teaching a lot. And I know a lot of academics complain, oh, I don't have time to write when I'm teaching so much. Did those both of those things come very easily to you?
They seem to, but one of the advantages of starting an academic career when you're 50 is that if you have kids, they're grown. I have two sons. They're fully grown and out in the world and doing their thing. So I didn't have a lot of domestic responsibilities. And I was so ready. I I discovered in the process of going through the PhD program in my 40s, I discovered all kinds of propensities and possibilities and in myself that I can't say I didn't know that they were there, but they were really way back on the back burner, and it was just a complete um, joy to be able to put that first and to be able
Hmm.
to follow the leads that appeared to me academically. So it just somehow just worked out, even though I got started really late.
That pent up enthusiasm makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah,
Or your metaphor about wanting to make an impact, right? Like little by little, I'm going to get there. That kind of excitement I'm not surprised it drove you
yeah,
to do what you did.
yeah.
So why don't you have a couple books? Maybe can you talk a little bit about how the ideas for each came and what that process was like for you?
Well, of course, I don't know, most of the first 10 years of my academic life was centered around the issue of gender. And we haven't talked about that at all, but that was a huge,
Why? How did that become a topic for you?
well, you know, I discovered, I mean, the whole issue of women was something that the women's movement had a huge impact on my life. I mean, it's hard to overemphasize it because of when I was born and the fact that in the 60s, the second wave of feminism came along, and it helped me to explain a lot of stuff about my own life and my choices that I had made and so forth, that all of a sudden it just accounted for an awful lot in my own life. And and so and in fact, um, when I was in the PhD program, I had several women friends that were ardent feminists, and they were after me to write my dissertation on some kind of something having to do with feminist theory or something. But I had this whole other thing, that namely race and the extent to which race and racial prejudice has shaped my life. I mean, shaped me as a white person, because I grew up in the South until I was 11 and was a very well-formed little racist until we moved to Cincinnati, which was one of the big terminuses on the Underground Railroad, and discovered that I was rooting for the wrong team here, and that was an epiphany that I, just was huge for me. So, I mean, and that's why I got involved in the urban crisis and all of that. So I kind of put the women's issues kind of on the back burner. Although when I look at my life, I can see how profoundly, sexism and so on affected me, including the way I thought. I had to divest myself of a lot of stuff that was pumped into me when I was a little kid. So, so there's all of that. So, people ask me every once in a while when I talk about women's issues why I didn't do my dissertation on some aspect of feminism, and I had friends who were urging me to do that. Students, I mean, fellow students, And I said, well, number one, there's not a person in this department that knows beans about women's issues. All of the regular faculty were male. Now, they were extraordinary men, and I owe them a ton and all of that. I mean, but you don't do your dissertation on something that nobody in your faculty knows anything about. Not if you
Right.
want to get
Well,
out.
and so that's sort of come up before, just sort of being guided during that dissertation process, right? Being guided a certain direction, or there's sort of a standard of what your dissertation should be that is often not that true passion or that creative purpose that maybe we get into public administration for or to pursue. So we've sort of heard that before. But yeah, so then the next big work out was on gender.
Yeah, well, see, just to back up a second from responding to what you said, of course, it was on my other true passion, you know, which was active citizens, and I had spent a decade or more working with active citizens and seeing their true active citizenship, their commitment to the betterment of their communities, and so forth. So I mean, that was just almost a no-brainer to do my dissertation inspired by their work. But there was also this thing of, and plus, there's nobody on the faculty that knows anything about women's issues or feminism or whatever. So that wouldn't have made any sense. And so it was after I got out that, I mean, it actually took me a while to get into writing about women's issues or the issue of women in public life. And so I did the gender images book. Let's see, I started teaching in 1987. The gender images, the first edition came out in, I think, 1991 or so. And then that sort of, it was at that point that I started thinking about, well, maybe I'm at the point now where I can really begin to think seriously about feminist theory and so forth. So the second book was Bureau Men, Settlement Women, and that was very, very much formed of a sort of a blend between my interest in community development and community power and grassroots issues and active citizenship with the question of women's place in public life. And so that book was kind of an amalgam of those two things. So, and my subsequent work has always been sort of a blend of those two ways of, coming at the world as a woman and also as somebody who wasn't born in a community that was struggling, God knows, but was always drawn to what do we do about this? This is a failure on the part of the most vaunted exceptionalist state that we have here. And what are we doing about it? So I've kind of gone back and forth ever since. I never wrote another book about feminism. I've written a couple more that had to do with sort of how that background applies to maybe what I might say is more theoretical issues. Governance in dark times, for example. I got very interested in Hannah Arendt and also in the change in the way people thought about government and what it could do after 9/11. So that's what that book is about.
Do you think that the present time is different than the time you write about in those books? Do you really still see the concept of bureau men alive in practice? Are we in dark times in terms of trust in government? Do you think, has practice changed since you wrote those books? Or
Well, I mean, you switched the question there.
sorry.
Practice, I think, has changed, but also so has the field has changed dramatically, and not for the better. Okay. I think the more public administration tries to turn itself into a hard science, the less equipped it is to help with any of what's going on now. So
Ooh, you want to say that again? I think that's a great point.
well, I mean, it's front and center in my perspective on the field at this point because it seems to me that, I mean, I just happened to end up in a department full of theorists, um, and you know they actually at one point invited me to become a co-author of what they called the Blacksburg Manifesto, um, in which they reflected on what was happening in the field and you know what they didn't like about that and the way they thought the field ought to develop in the future, which was to maintain a sort of balance between theory and practice or between politics and administration and so forth, and to resist the urge to to do what happened, which is to transform administration into management, and therefore to upset the balance between politics and administration that was generative of how the field got started in its early days. And I have to say I was much inspired by reading Dwight Waldo, The Administrative State, during a doctoral seminar at Virginia Tech. And honestly, I have to say it was really transformative reading that book because I was kind of going along being interested in stuff, but you know, I'm a perpetual student, so I'm always interested in stuff. But reading Waldo, all of a sudden I thought, oh God, yes, right. Yeah, now I get what this field is about. You know, now I really want to participate. I want to write stuff because, you know, that idea that administration is not something that happens in a vacuum, but it's always in a political setting and it always carries forth values. It's just which ones, you know? And so that was a huge influence on my further development. I couldn't be who I am today if I hadn't read The Administrative State at that point in my intellectual development where I saw, and it's not, you know, it's a funny book. It's not terribly well written. It's awfully turgid at points, but you know, what it says is just dynamite if you're ready to receive it. And I've actually participated over the years on panels where I was the defender of Waldo against the guys who were lined up on the other side telling me that I really ought to be a Simon aficionado instead.
Well, so I think that point about Waldo is another great one. We definitely want students of public administration to listen to this podcast and hopefully pick up some tips about how to further their career. And so that point about reading a book at the right time,
Yeah.
playing with the themes, seeing how they relate to different ideas is certainly, and that was a passion and a driver for you in your direction, I think is a great thing for students to hear.
Yeah, absolutely.
More broadly, how do you feel about your books today? Did it feel good writing them? And do you think they still...
For a long time, after I wrote Gender Images, I don't know what I expected, but I thought, well, I dropped a little pebble into the pool and it sank to the bottom and disappeared. I couldn't see that it was having any influence at all. Although it was selling, you know, for an academic book fairly well. I would think I was kind of the diversity factor in a lot of courses. And, you know, I don't mind being the diversity factor, but I sure wanted to be more than that. You know, I wanted to have a profound
Right.
Certainly.
on the way the field developed as a whole. And I eventually decided that, well, you know, those who have ears will it will listen, and those that don't have any ears, there's nothing you can do about them. But I think the field, I guess I was about to expatiate on how I think the field has changed, and I do think it has narrowed in a way that makes me sad, because I've always thought that the strength of public administration as an academic field was exactly this struggle that were, at least when I came up in it, this struggle between being immersed and standing back, you know, being practical and being theoretical, et cetera, all those different ways of saying that. And so if in a balanced field in public administration, you don't dismiss facts. Of course you don't. You don't dismiss science. Those questions that can be answered from that framework, back to the framework question, of course you need to have scientific chops. But there's so many of the most important questions in public administration that can't be answered that way, that are, William Connolly called, and probably other people, essentially contested. I mean, there are questions that don't have right answers. And so I started giving papers at conferences about the difference between right answers and good reasons, you know. So you want to have, as an administrator, you got to have good reasons, because you have to account to other people for what you do. Not only your bosses in the bureaucracy, but also citizens and so on. But right answers are not, you don't get a lot of right answers when it comes to the question of what do you do. And so, but you do have to think about why you're doing what you do, and be able to give reasons, and try to persuade people that your reasons are persuasive. And some people will, no matter how good an argument you make, people of goodwill will disagree, because people of goodwill do disagree. That's politics at its best. So to me, the field, this relentless quest to drive out anything except quantitative empiricism, is just it's just a mistake, because there's so many questions that can't be answered by equations. And the most important questions, which are political questions, can't be answered that way. And so that's why I always tried to make the argument that you got to have a balance. Somehow you have to try to integrate, and the whole passel of essentially contested questions that are fated to be argued about forever. And that's what Waldo said. See, he said that there are questions like who should rule, and should we be centralized or decentralized, that are essentially political questions. And so we have to have those political chops, we teachers, we practitioners, that help us figure out how to wrestle with them. And that's why, to me, the whole question of citizenship and the relation between administrators and citizens is so crucial, because some of these questions, all we can do is keep talking about them. We have to keep having conversations. And there's nothing like an equation to be a conversation stopper. That's the point of science, to make the debate come to an end, because now we've got the truth. Okay? And the truth shall make us free. And the truth shall make administration powerful. Okay?
If I may, thinking about the idea that the field has become heavily empirical and that we do have this challenge, there's going to be junior faculty, PhD students, everybody who feels like they kind of have to fall in line with doing research in the way that the field has kind of started moving towards. What would you tell somebody in terms of how they can potentially escape, or why they should escape that approach and take much more of the broad viewpoint?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the way people are taught and socialized as they come through academic programs. And that, so that's worrisome, because I fear that people in PhD programs are getting a very clear message. If you're serious, you're going to be a quantitative empiricist. And Cam she's got some cute things to say, and she's fun to have on a panel and all of that, but don't take her seriously. Um, there's not much you can do about that except just to keep talking. But I think there are programs that haven't drunk that Kool-Aid totally. And so, I haven't given up, but I think that when I look at PAR, for example, I was an associate editor of PAR with Larry Terry, who was the editor in chief. We both came out of Virginia Tech. Larry was political to the marrow of his bones, and he knew how to operate in that climate, and he was enormously effective. If you look at PAR during the first 5 or 6 years of the 2000s and see what was in it, and then you look at what's in it now, and it's night and day. I get PAR still. I actually just resigned from ASPA, not because out of protest or anything, but I just thought it just doesn't interest me anymore. And you look at PAR today, and it's full of all these little angels on the head of a pin kind of research. And the thinking.
Well, so it's easier to answer small questions empirically than sort of the big questions, the political questions that you were talking
Well,
about,
see,
too.
yes, yes and no. I resist the urge that there's only one way to be empirical, and it's to do a controlled experiment or as close to that as you can come. Empirical just means you're looking at the world, you're trying to learn from the world. And I'm pretty much of a phenomenologist, which means you look at the interaction between human beings and the material world, and see how human beings are making sense of what they encounter in the world, and how that sense making then feeds back into the way the world gets understood, and therefore how it goes forward. To me, that's a much more productive way of doing research particularly in an applied field, where the point is to come up with knowledge that is useful. And it's not that quantitative empiricism can't come up with stuff that's useful. It can, but it's not all there is. That's all. I'm such a reasonable person. I wouldn't make much of a revolutionary, because I just keep saying to these people, don't you see that there's all kinds of questions that can't be answered empirically? And there are a lot of guys, I think they're mostly guys, though not always. I don't want to give guys a bum rap, who just, they're just totally blind to the idea that there could be any question worth researching that can't be turned into numbers. Okay, so what are you going to do?
Do you think that your practical experience or experience as a practitioner helped to inform this view?
Oh, yeah.
And I think about it sometimes with PhD students, right? Like, I really want to don't get your PhD, go work. I think that people come back with a much more enlightened approach to this work.
Well, I totally agree. And of course, I would, because I worked for 20 years before I switched and became an academic. And I don't think you have to do that much. But I do think about people coming right out of college and going in. And that's what these guys want, see, because then they can shape people before they're fully formed. They're barely hatched out of the egg, and intellectually. And, life teaches you a lot of stuff, and it helps to have a little of life, before you start thinking about what's really important to you. I owe so much to the people I interacted with in Anacostia and the other communities in DC. I remember one woman saying to me when she heard I was going into the PhD program, and she said, "Well, Cam," she said, "I think you might not be ruined." I said, I'm going to try not to be ruined. I really am.
I'm going to try.
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh so hard.
So we're coming up on time, and we've thought about doing a lightning round. I don't know that I want to do the lightning round questions with you, but a highlight from your career, a moment where you felt it wasn't just a pebble in the ocean, but you had a real impact. And then maybe a difficult time in your career, because we really think that a lot of people can learn from, yes, we all have challenges, and then what did we do about them?
You know, I hope this doesn't sound weird, but I think the difficult stuff, most of the difficult stuff for me came much earlier. I mean, it's a factor of my age. I mean, by that I mean when I was born and what was going on in the world when I came up as a young person. I graduated from college in 1960. Okay. That was when the women's movement wasn't even a tweet on the horizon. And so the women's movement had a profound effect on me. And so, I think the hard stuff for me was realizing that I had something to give and something to do beyond um, being somebody's wife and somebody's mother. Not that those are not important to me, but that there was more to life than that, and that I was going to be sort of stunted in a way if I didn't do something. So that was the hardest part for me. I think was coming to have the courage, because I just thought, what would I do? I'm scared. Was coming to myself as a person and realizing that the one thing I always had confidence in was my brain. Okay, never for a moment did I wonder about whether I
Good.
had the intellectual power. It was everything else that was kind of telling me, no, this is what you're supposed to do. And once I realized that, well, okay, that's important, but it's not all there is. That I kind of came out of the cage, and was able to do some stuff.
When you were talking about, that in PhD programs, the idea that we need to kind of focus more on you think of a good way of putting this, not the heavy empiricism, but kind of rethink of how we're training people, what we're training them in. For a lot of people that are either out of PhD programs that are already in a PhD program that's kind of taking that heavily empirical perspective, are there any resources that you would point them to say, here's someplace you might want to kind of start looking for your own edification to kind of start build that up for yourself?
Well, yeah, I have two reactions to that. One is that I refuse to let positivism have the word empirical, because I've become more and more of a phenomenologist over the years, and that was very much influenced by my husband, Ralph Hummel, who was Mr. Phenomenology, on legs. And phenomenology is also very empirical. In fact, I'd say it's more empirical than empiricism, because it takes the world as it comes to it, instead of trying to, massage it and force it into a list of variables. So I forgot where I was going with that. So the field is, I think it has bitten off this tiny piece of empiricism, and there's a whole lot of, I got very interested in action research, for example, where you let the world speak to you, and then you make sense of it, and then you go back out to the world and you say, here's what I heard. Does that make sense? Yeah, this part does, but that part doesn't. Okay, so let me go back and think about it a little more, come back out and say, well, okay, what if I gave you this? What would you do with it? that kind of interchange between researchers and people who are doing whatever it is that you're interested in studying, to me, is enormously productive. And it's the only kind of research that and it's very phenomenological too. So that's the kind of research I think we need more of. And the problem with quantitative empiricism is not it, it's what it does to try to eliminate everything else. I have nothing against quantitative empiricism. And when I taught logic of inquiry, we spent a lot of time talking about what's the logic underneath this way of doing research? What are the things you have to assume and start from? Where are you starting from? But it's not the only place to start from, and it doesn't answer all the interesting questions. So it depends on the questions you want answers to. And some of them require you to come at the world from a different angle than that, where you have to eliminate all the stuff that isn't interesting and you have to, blah, blah, blah. You all know the rap as well as I do. So better probably. But I had colleagues at Cleveland State who somebody would make the mistake of saying in class to him, this one guy, but Cam said, and he says, don't listen to Cam. Sit back and let us turn you into a scientist. Well, see, I object to that. Not because they're not listening to me, but because they're narrowing themselves in a way that shuts off so much of the world that can teach us.
I think that is a great point. I think the institutions around us sometimes make it difficult to say, let's take some time and let's take some space and let's think through why or how, or let's take some time away from being an academic and engage in practice, or, let's add 3 years to the timeline to publish this paper in order to truly engage with what's going on. And so I think it's great that you can say it and bring that point of view to the field. And
well, I just think that, not all the interesting questions can be answered quantitatively. That's just I have to say that's a fact, although it really isn't a fact because the word interesting is in there. But so what? Are we in a field to pile up laboratory results, or are we in a field, particularly our field? We're supposed to be being useful to the world, aren't we? Isn't that the point of public administration? And you don't have to go very far with the results of experiments before you realize that human beings are a different kettle of fish. And so, I could go on forever. So have me back sometime.
Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you all. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.